Development or debt? Beijing promises billions in African investments, but are there strings attached? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is the China-Africa Forum. New roads, railways and airports. China is handing out billion-dollar loans, filling a void in Africa's infrastructure deficit. From Angola to Zambia, there's hardly a country in the continent that doesn't boast Chinese investment. Last year alone, new Chinese projects in Africa were valued at more than $76 billion. But is Beijing a trustworthy partner? Generous loans may be welcomed by leaders, but some view the cash with suspicion. Many African nations are only just recovering from years of debt distress. And as Africa's biggest investor, Beijing is guaranteed to always have a major say at the negotiating table. So is their relationship really win-win? Sandra Gatman takes a look.
$80 billion. That's how much China has pledged to African nations in grants, interest-free loans, and credit lines towards infrastructure projects. A welcome announcement for more than 50 African leaders meeting in Beijing.
China has deserved to be considered nowadays as a true friend of Africa. No historical colonial links with Africa.
What more can you wish for from a friend than to stretch a hand of friendship in order to raise you up when you are flat on your stomach?
China has invested billions of dollars into the continent, building bridges, airports, and roads, in part to expand China's trade routes under the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. In return, Africa's economies overall have skyrocketed.
A lot of African countries are now doing much better than they were previously, and the growth rates have improved a lot in Africa compared with what they were 10 or 15 years ago. And I think that China has been perhaps the most important catalyst for this change.
But skeptics have also raised concern about Beijing's ambitions to spread its influence and soft power. China's president addressed that fear head-on.
既不干预非洲国家探索符合国情的发展道路，不干涉非洲内政，不把自己的意志强加于人，不在对非援助中附加任何政治条件，不在对非投资融资中谋取政治私利。
According to data from Johns Hopkins University, China loaned around $125 billion to the continent between 2000 and 2016. It's led to high debt in countries like Djibouti, Congo, and Zambia. Zambia, for instance, has a GDP of $19.5 billion and owes $6 billion to China. Critics like the U.S. say the huge loans create dependency.
We partner with African countries by incentivizing good governance to meet long-term security and development goals. This stands in stark contrast to China's approach, which encourages dependency, using opaque contracts, predatory loan practices, and corrupt deals that mire nations in debt and undercut their sovereignty.
One example is the Gauge Railway in Kenya, which was built and financed by China to connect the capital Nairobi with Mombasa. Critics say instead of funding the refurbishment of the existing line, the construction of a new one cost $3 billion, 3 times as much as the industry standard. Others say there is plenty of Chinese investment, but not enough trade.
Nigeria imports 25% of its trade from China, but exports minimally or nothing to China. It's a one-sided relationship, and we need to address the balance.
Despite reservations about the viability of China and Africa's economic partnership, some African leaders say the choice was theirs to make, and that Western fears might be a case of sour grapes. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Let's bring in our panel. From Washington, D.C., we have Liberia's former Minister of Public Works, Jude Moore. He also served as the Deputy Chief of Staff to former Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. In Davis, California, we have Grant Harris. He was the former U.S. President Barack Obama's senior advisor on Africa. And from New York, we have the director of the China National Association, Victor Gao. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Jude Moore, let me start with you. Is this debt trap diplomacy, as some call it, with China investing billions more into Africa?
Again, thank you for having me. And in my last piece, I argued that the debt trap diplomacy case has never been compellingly made. There's been no evidence presented to show that China is engaged in debt trap diplomacy. Chinese investment in Africa has actually come as an excellent opportunity for Africa. China, it appears, is the only country with both the inclination and the resources to address Africa's vast infrastructure deficit. So, no, I am one of the people who do not agree with the debt trap diplomacy line, and I don't think there's any evidence to be able to support that.
Grant Harris, do you agree that the African continent should be welcoming Chinese investment and aid with open arms?
I do think the African continent should be welcoming investment from all countries around the world, but I think how the investment is conducted does matter. And to say that some of the investment is too heavy on debt and loans and too heavy on taking strategic assets in return is not to cast aspersions on all Chinese investment across the board. There are some cases, whether it's Djibouti or other countries around the world, where the amount of debt provided by China is really to an irresponsible level. For instance, in Djibouti, between 2014 and 2016, because of Chinese debt, the debt to GDP ratio has shot up from 50 to 85%. We're talking about a very small country, less than 1 million people, less than $2 billion for the country's GDP. Yet with China's massive investments, they're really able to make grand concessions and at risk of taking over the port or taking over geostrategic resources.
Victor Gao, what's in it for China? What does it need? Does it need land? Does it need goods and services? Is it agricultural products? Or is it just gaining that political foothold?
Thank you very much for having me. As we speak, the China-African Summit is going on in Beijing, and more than 50 heads of states and heads of government from many African countries are gathered in Beijing to talk with the Chinese leaders about how they can cooperate and how the two sides can really contribute to capacity building, to the nation building in many African countries. Now, for the many infrastructure projects in Africa, as a general rule of thumb, almost in any commercial activities you undertake, equity as well as debt are equally important. Therefore, to focus on debt is probably misleading, at least to a certain extent. Now, for any particular project, if you purely measure whether some of the African countries can afford or can pay either equity or debt, then your conclusion is probably that many of these countries will not be able to undertake many of these mega infrastructure projects, whether they are roads, railways, airports, seaports, you name it. However, I think the key to the success in many African countries is to build up infrastructure connectivity to enable their companies and society at large to engage in many of these
they need, right, Mr. Gao?
Economic enterprises.
Certainly, and that's what they need.
Absolutely,
but then again, looking at it again from the other perspective, from what the Chinese actually want or need, the C word, not the very rude one, the other one, colonialism. Are African countries giving up their sovereignty by getting into these deals with the Chinese?
Well, I think the Chinese engagement with Africa started in the late 1950s, and across all these decades, it has never ceased. At a time when many European countries walked away from Africa, partially because of the national independence in Africa, and China has been consistent in treating African countries and African peoples as equal. We call each other brothers and sisters, and therefore, politically speaking, mutual support is very important. Now, since 2000, the Chinese engagement in Africa has more and more moved into economic and trading relations. And indeed, China is now the largest trading partner for Africa as a whole. And China has invested heavily in many African countries, in infrastructure in particular. What China needs from Africa is very simple: mutual respect and brotherhood and partnership, and enabling each other to mutually benefit from such economic and trading relations. And this is not colonialism either. If you call it colonialism, either you do not understand what colonialism means, or you misunderstand. All these economic and trading relations are really taking place for the benefit of the African countries and peoples.
Okay, so Grant Harris, you clearly have, you have one side that's more powerful and wealthy than the other, and they're making big offers here. And one of the things we've heard a lot of over the past decade and a half or so, is that there are no strings attached when it comes to the Chinese. When it comes to the US and the Europeans, they have too many caveats and there's too many needles to thread here in order to get the aid or even trade. When it's the Chinese, no strings attached. And that's why, while the others were asleep at the wheel, those in the West, the Chinese have moved in and they're doing business, no more, no less. How do you feel about that?
I think that a lot of the language that is thrown around can be quite misleading. To say that there are no strings attached, there are strings attached. For instance, it's not acceptable for an African state to recognize Taiwan. And the only African state that's really not represented in today's summit in Beijing is that which still has diplomatic ties. But let's put that aside. I think what we're talking about is not so much colonialism as classically defined. We're talking about a broad-ranging engagement with a continent. Some of the investments are incredibly helpful in aiding infrastructure development, but some of the investments are really opaque. They are disregarding environmental and social issues. They are not transparently disclosing the terms, and they're taking on as collateral strategic assets where these projects aren't always going to be successful, and some of them are not just economic decisions. It's not just about what should be debt, what should be equity. It's about, are these lemons in some of the projects that are being pursued? And I would just finally say, we need to look at the example of Sri Lanka, where a major Chinese project to develop a port that really saw very little ship traffic, was not going to be an economic success. But then when it started to fail and the Sri Lankan government was overly leveraged in debt to Beijing, they sacrificed control of the port in a long-term lease and the area around the port too. So it's a broader play than just investing in good infrastructure projects.
Yeah, and it's caused a lot of outcry in Sri Lanka. Hambantota, that's the port. It left the country owing China billions, about $13 billion as far as I understand. That's a big issue in Sri Lanka. Perhaps there are fears that this could happen to African countries. Jude Moore, I want to pick up on a point that Grant made. He mentioned Eswatini. People more popularly know it as Swaziland, I guess. They said, hey, we recognize Taiwan. China said, you're not invited to our summit. You recognize Taiwan. We don't like you. We don't do trade with you. You're out. Aha. So what do you mean by no strings attached? Of course there's strings attached. You have to be on side politically with the Chinese. Is that the price African countries have to pay?
Every country has its own national security objectives. It has its own foreign policy, and the one China policy has been consistently Chinese policy towards how it deals with the rest of the world, and Africa isn't any different from that. I, however, wanted to be able to make a few comments about the debt trap diplomacy, because debt trap diplomacy assumes that it is in China's strategic interest for its partners to take on loans that burden them and go into debt distress, allowing China to be able to take advantage of that circumstance, to be able to take over flagship infrastructure and strategic infrastructure. If that were the case, and everybody uses Sri Lanka as an example, what about Venezuela? Venezuela owes China more money than any other country, almost $50 billion. We haven't seen Chinese actors moving into Venezuela to be able to take over Venezuelan assets if that were the case. I do not believe that the case for debt diplomacy has been made. Africa's total external debt stock is around $6 trillion, of which less than 2% is owned by the Chinese. Djibouti is heavily leveraged, absolutely, as it would be for any lender. But to assume that China is actually in Africa and irresponsibly lending to African countries, the China-Africa Research Institute at Johns Hopkins University that tracks financing, Chinese financing in Africa, recently released a paper that showed that China is not the cause of debt distress in African countries. Most African countries have taken debt from traditional lenders, from the private sector, and China's presence in Africa, again, almost 78 billion of the money that China has given to African countries have gone to infrastructure that is really, really needed on the continent if we are to be able to develop economically. So again, to try to close the space of Chinese lending and Chinese partnership with Africa by this language of debt diplomacy doesn't really do well. And again, I should point out that in 2000, at the end of the turn of the century, when there were civil wars and AIDS was ravaging the continent, most Western countries didn't look at Africa as a place to do business. Most Western countries' policy toward Africa was largely development. And it was in that context in 2000 that the Chinese launched the Forum on Africa, China-Africa Cooperation. And every year over the last 18 years, China has backed that policy with substantial material resources to be able to develop the relationship with Africa. So I, as an African and as one who's served in an African government, we welcome Chinese engagement in Africa. Obviously, countries have to be responsible in terms of how they take on debt. But that has not been something that the Chinese has foisted on African countries or African countries have been swindled into accepting.
Victor Gao, have the Chinese sensed opportunity because Western nations just didn't pay enough attention?
No, I don't think so. I think unlike many Western countries which have major liabilities and skeletons in their closets in dealing with Africa, for example, colonialism or slavery in the past, for example, and plundering of resources from African countries at the bayonet's point, for example, China has no such political liability. China has always treated African countries and people as brothers and sisters, and equality and equal treatment are the cornerstones for China-African countries. And based on this, I think now China-African countries are really cooperating very closely to build up infrastructure, to enable industrialization, to set up all kinds of industrial parks, etc. This is not the so-called neo-colonialism, because the taste of the pudding is really in eating it. You need to ask the African countries themselves whether they want to have these infrastructure projects built up, or whether they want to move on to the path of industrialization. And I think this is mutually beneficial, and Western countries, including the United States or all the other European countries, are welcome to go to Africa to really undertake one project under another, to lend to the African countries, to assist in the process of industrialization, to enable the African countries to grow faster than before. This is what China needs. China has no monopoly in Africa. China really welcomes the opportunities to work with other developed countries, other emerging countries, to pool our resources together. And the objective is the better development of the African countries and the better happiness of the African people.
Grant Harris, for many people, Theresa May dancing awkwardly recently, I think in Kenya, was a sort of microcosm of the awkward relationship that many Western countries, particularly former colonial powers, have with the continent and different countries within the continent. While she dances awkwardly, while Donald Trump's only tweet on record, and I might be mistaken, about the continent, at least in recent history, was to allege that there's a white genocide taking place in South Africa, right? So while, again, these traditional powers, the UK, the United States, and I'm particularly interested in your thoughts with regards to the United States, seem to be asleep at the wheel, have the Chinese taken the opportunity because Western policy vis-a-vis the African continent has just been rubbish?
I think the Chinese have been, for decades now, making grand investments in the continent. And I think it's to their credit that there's a massive infusion of capital for many projects. But I think it's naive to say that 100% of engagement is all positive, that there's nothing negative, that there's nothing problematic with massive amounts of debt that don't have transparency associated with them. To point to Venezuela or one or two examples where things aren't happening doesn't disprove the point. the same Johns Hopkins paper and other things that have been cited have still said that though there are many causes of the high debt burden in Africa, in some cases, whether it's Djibouti or elsewhere, others citing Namibia, looking at increasing debt in Ethiopia and Kenya as well, that there are cause for concern in terms of the amount of debt being taken on. So I think it's naive to argue that absolutely 100% positive. If we're going to be talking about how this looks over time, we've got to remember there's no such thing as a free lunch.
Well, let's see if African countries will end up paying for that lunch. If they are perhaps hidden strings attached, we'll be watching China's engagement with the entire continent very closely as the summit unfolds and wraps up. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure having you all on the program. Jude Moore, Grant Harris and Victor Gawe, thank you for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Still to come on the program, Kerala on the path to recovery after flooding kills hundreds and leaves more than 1 million homeless. But is India's government neglecting the state? And a court in Myanmar sentences 2 journalists to jail. But were they framed in a bid to silence them? They were the worst floods in Kerala for almost a century. More than 400 people were killed and almost 2 million have been left homeless in the southern Indian state. Now that the rains have subsided, it's time to rebuild. The state's finance minister says it needs $3 billion, but India's central government has offered only a fraction of that. To seemingly make matters worse, they've even rejected outside aid. The UAE offered a helping hand, but India said no thanks, and Keralites are far from happy. So why is India rejecting help from abroad? Haider Abbasi explains.
No one saw it coming. Unusually heavy rains in India's southern state of Kerala, causing the worst flooding in almost a century. At least 400 people had been killed, and nearly 2 million were forced to leave their homes.
My home has been totally destroyed. My furniture was ruined, as well as the stored clothes and food. All of them were washed away by floods. The water gushed into the house so quickly and we escaped in such a hurry that we didn't have time to bring any other belongings.
As the deluge receded, the extent of the damage it's caused has become clearer. Kerala's finance minister says it will cost $3 billion to rebuild. There have been offers of help from several countries. The United Arab Emirates was prepared to give $100 million, but India turned it down. The government says it has a policy of relying on its own emergency funds and agencies. Analysts say India wants to prove it can handle such disasters on its own. But so far, New Delhi has pledged only $85 million, a fraction of the money needed. Kerala's leaders aren't pleased. They say they're being discriminated against because the state is governed by a communist party, while the federal government is run by the Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP. And although the BJP denies it, hardline supporters seem to think otherwise. Some believe the floods are a punishment. The leader of one Hindu nationalist party has said, beef eaters are responsible for this calamity. Unlike religious minorities in Kerala, Hindus regard cows as sacred, but Kerala is home to a large Christian and Muslim population who do eat beef. Chakrapani also said only people who don't eat beef in Kerala should be given aid. India denies all allegations of discrimination and says the aid it's providing to Kerala is enough. But Kerala has been accused of not being properly prepared for the disaster. Just a month before the floods, the government said Kerala was among the worst of the southern states at managing water resources. Others say New Delhi is to blame, as Kerala doesn't get early flood warnings like other states. Is Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government neglecting states that aren't governed by his BJP, and should it rethink the way it deals with disaster relief? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this further, let's speak to Thomas Isaac in Thiruvananthapuram. He is the Minister of Finance for Kerala and a Central Committee member of the Communist Party of India. And in New Delhi, we have Amit Kapoor. He's the chairman of the India Institute for Competitiveness. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Thomas Isaac, let me begin with you, sir. So just so I understand it completely clearly, we've had the floods, you're trying to rebuild, we have disease issues, people are still suffering, people are dying. And as far as I understand, you're saying the central government's not giving you the funds that you need. Is that where you stand?
Well, we are disappointed with the amount of money they have granted us. Now, it doesn't meet a fraction of the requirements. And therefore, we are looking for alternatives. Now, our choices are limited because we have gone to a national GST that has totally bound our hands regarding enhancement of tax revenues and so on. Therefore, with central government being very niggardly and miserly, and avenues of additional resource mobilization being limited, we have appealed to the people to come forward. The Malayali diaspora in India and outside. And the initial feedback has been very, very encouraging. I think it is going to be an all-time record inflow of donations coming to Chief Minister's Distress Relief Fund. Initially, our expectation was something like an amount equivalent to what the central government has now allotted us. But now we have more double the amount. And I think it may go to 4 or 5 times the grant given by the central government. So that gives us a confidence, yes, we will be able to overcome. Just like we have withstood the floods, we will be able to take forward the reconstruction activities.
Amit Kapoor, why does it seem as if the central government is being stingy here? Keralites are dying, Keralites are suffering, Keralites need to rebuild, and we have the man in the know, Mr. Isaac, saying they're only receiving a fraction of the funds that they need. What's going on?
So I think when you're saying that the central government is being stingy, I think there are larger issues that we have to understand as to what is really happening. As the minister had actually said, like there is a new form of taxation, the GST, and that is actually causing some set of concerns. But I really don't think here that there is a stinginess here. I think it's being made into a larger issue as a political issue, and that's an unfortunate reality. I don't think it's a political issue. It is more in terms of like how quickly the central government can actually do, what are the issues of governance, and so on and so forth. I look at it as a larger issue of governance and a larger issue of how states and the federal government actually react and act together. So there are those issues that we really need to actually take into account. And then, of course, like from a political viewpoint, there are many issues that are emerging which say there is a BJP versus the state or whatever. I find that to be fairly annoying because that just finishes the debate in terms of like we are not respecting the dead, we are not respecting the issue, rather than focusing on the thing. So I think this is where I would also suggest that the central government should actually come forward much stronger. They should allay the fears and work towards it.
Okay.
In the past, as like whenever we've had
let me understand something, if you don't mind, right? So I want to understand something. If this is not the deliberate withholding of funds, and there's no nefarious element to that, and you say this is part of a larger issue between the state and the central government and how they govern, are you saying that essentially the system's broken and it's because of incompetence?
So when you're saying the system itself, I think there is an urgent need for a structural change in the governance structure of the country. Because I think this is where, like, when you say that we are dependent on central government for everything, but the states in themselves are fairly powerful units which can do something significant. And within the states itself, they have to actually look at the larger issue in terms of like how they manage disaster. They have to create the sets of systems in place and bring the systems in place. So the larger structural issue actually does exist at hand. Now, the question is also in terms of like how the state and the center, interacts, what kind of funds can actually go through.
Right.
And as the minister had actually said, like the diaspora is helping, so it is going to happen that way.
But then again, okay, they shouldn't need to ask the diaspora, the Malayali diaspora, for money, or they shouldn't need the UAE's money if they can even get it, right? Again, I'm struggling because I want to get to the heart of it all. Does the central government want to give them money, but they can't? What's going on? What's the hindrance here? Do they want to actually give them money and something's blocking them?
I think there is a larger issue here. Like, where is the money in the system itself? Like, what is the kind of money that is required? I think there is a significant amount that is required for rebuilding, and the government of India, that is the central government, should actually give as much as possible. They should not really stall it. But I think the issue as of now is to really rebuild the humanitarian help that is actually required. The money will happen on its own. In fact, as of now, the focus should actually be and as to how do we rebuild, how do we really help the disease that is actually emerging, how do we stop that, how do we actually get food to people. So right now it is a humanitarian intervention that is required, people are required, rather than saying that the money goes into the banks. The money will come. I don't think that the money is not going to come. I think we're just overshooting the thing. We have to really wait. We have to get our act in order. We need to make sure that things on the ground are getting right. The water is receding, people are not getting affected with disease, and so on and so forth. There is also a larger thing that you have to look at, like the mistake the governments have actually, successive governments have done in Kerala. They have simply destroyed the fragile ecosystem that actually exists there. I'm not blaming the present government or whatever, but I'm saying the successive governments in the past, the people out there in terms of creating high-rise buildings, just flouting the norms.
Okay, so let me take that point. Okay, so Thomas Isaac, do you have to bear some of the blame as the state government in Kerala for the kind of disaster that could have been? You can't avoid flooding, you can't stop the rains, but you can stop its aftermath because you didn't get your house in order on the ground. Is that a fair accusation?
No, there is some truth in it. This present flood should prompt us to review our development policies, particularly with the land development policies in the ecologically fragile regions and river basin management and so on. But don't exaggerate it. The worst flood in Kerala occurred in 1924, which was worse than this. That's the part of our history. Well, then Kerala was in its pristine glory, but still floods came. Therefore, while accepting the fact there are many issues of ecological concern, now this is not a man-made disaster. The actual rain that happened in 4 or 5 days' time is something like in the basin of some of the major rivers, so 600% of what was predicted, what was the normal rain. And no system could have handled that. And this is something similar that happened in 1924. Therefore, definitely, when we are going to reconstruct Kerala, we will learn proper lessons from this natural disaster. How we could have managed it better. That is point number one. Point number two, how we could have improved the water retention capacity of our major river basins, how the landslides could have been avoided if we had been more careful with the land development policies, the hilly terrain, and so on. Proper lessons will be learned and taken. But nevertheless, you have to accept the fact it's an unprecedented rainfall, something very similar to what happened in 1924, which created this havoc. And therefore, I think it will be unfair to make such a allegation.
Sir, Mr. Isaac, do you at all feel that the BJP-led central government doesn't want to help you as much as it should be helping you because you're communists?
Look, our chief minister, his response to the initial, very small amount of grant given was that he will take up with the Prime Minister of India. Very well, we'll talk to the Prime Minister. That was his response to the denial of the donation from UAE to Kerala. That we will take it to the Prime Minister. Now, at this moment of time, we don't want to politicize it that way. In fact, we are continuing the dialogue with the central government. Of the total money we require, 1/3 is for revenue expenditure. 2/3 would be for capital expenditure. Now, the state governments to borrow, they need to get permission from center. So we are telling the center, we need this money, just give us permission. don't stand by this fiscal deficit ceiling. Central government the last 15 years have been much above the fiscal deficit ceiling imposed by FRBM Act. Therefore, don't play around with that. Kerala needs this money, allow us to borrow. Well, I am going to meet the finance minister, give him the memorandum. Secondly, we are asking, we need revenue. Unless we mobilize revenue, my revenue deficit will be yawning, and that will make my debts unsustainable.
Right.
And therefore, we are saying, you give grant. But I understand, central government is also in a very good shape. And for the amounts of fiscal deficit is high, they may not be able to give the grant. Then I am telling, please permit me to have a search on GST. GST Council, I hope will discuss that. Thirdly, I'm saying, there are lots of friends of Kerala all over.
Yes.
A country like UAE, a special relationship. Half the population hails from Kerala.
Yeah.
Want to help us. Don't stand in the way.
Okay.
Don't stand in the way.
These
That
are
will be a
interesting
dog in the
points.
major policy.
And so far, the central government hasn't accepted any aid from the United Arab Emirates. Amit Kapoor, is that a mistake? As we heard from Mr. Isaac, you could have, 100,000 Malayalis in Dubai and Sharjah and elsewhere who go to Western Union and send a remittance back and want to actually help their families and their brethren. What on earth is the difference between that and maybe just the UAE as well going, hey, we want to pad that. We want to give that a little bit of a push. We want to add a few million to it so that the state can properly recover. What's wrong with that, and why has the government refused this aid?
So, this is a very important question that we are dabbling with. I think somewhere in 2009, the genesis for this lies in 2009. I think at that point in time when the tsunami had actually hit, the government of India at some point in time had said, oh, we are self-sustaining as a nation and we are not going to accept some grants. Or we are not going to accept aid, we are an aid-giving nation. But I think that's a very limited view to things. In fact, in the case of disaster like, say, Kerala, I really do not see that why we should not accept humanitarian aid, why we should not really accept aid from people who are actually coming in. I do not think it is in any way demeaning ourselves. It is just a question of accepting a neighbor's or a friend's, helping hand, and we should actually look at it. But having said that, I think the whole aid thing that we are talking about from UAE, there has been very varied sets of information that is actually coming through. There are some positives, there are some negatives. But there seems to be something that does not meet the eye. The government of India has not been very clear in terms of why they are not accepting it. Even if there is an amount which is like, say, X $million or X hundreds of millions of dollars, there is absolutely no evidence to the fact that it's being properly offered or what was actually happening. There is that fake news, deep fake news, and so on and so forth. But I think on a larger front, India should not really...
we've got the minister... We've got the minister from the States saying the UAE are offering money. So, I doubt that's fake news. We're hearing it from the man himself, right? We have to rule out the fake news because the man's saying the UAE offered it to us.
Oh, yes. So once the minister is saying, I absolutely accept the point that he's making, and I respect what he's saying. And I really think that if there is a friendly aid that is being offered, we should accept it. It's a question of, if there is a disaster in the world across the board, and if India is going to help, give a helping hand, why not? It's actually a question of something happens in, say, Sri Lanka or Pakistan or, say, Nepal. If we extend a helping hand, why not? We should do that. I think I respect what the minister is saying, and we can't really disagree with him. Right. In fact, when the minister is making a very powerful statesman, taking a statesman's position, when he says that we should go and talk to the central government and say that you should extend the aid and so on and so forth. I think we should look at it and cut away the whole political milieu that is happening here. It is about India, it's about Indians, it's about us, and we should work together to rebuild.
And for the people, the Keralites there, more than 400 dead in floods, more than 1 million displaced, and now fears of dengue, cholera, one of the big immediate issues, leptospirosis or rat fever, hundreds of confirmed cases. So big challenges ahead. It's been good to chat to both of you, Thomas Isaac and Amit Kapoor. Thank you very much for joining us on Newsmakers.
And I was shocked today in the morning when I woke up and I learned that these 2 journalists from Reuters have been imposed a sentence of 7 years of jail. I think the information they gave on the massacre was of public interest. And I think also that all the process, the trial was a travesty of justice.
Myanmar's rocky record on human rights has frequently found itself in the spotlight, and now a controversial verdict has once again turned the world's attention on the country. A court has sentenced 2 journalists to 7 years in prison for violating a law on state secrets. Walon and Kya So'u were investigating the army's alleged killings of men from the persecuted Rohingya ethnic minority in northern Rakhine state. The 2 Reuters reporters were then arrested carrying official documents, but both claim to be innocent and say they were framed in a bid to silence them. Well, to discuss this, let's speak to the attorney representing the jailed journalists, Kin Maung So, in Yangon. He's a member of the Independent Lawyers Association of Myanmar. And in Bangkok, we have Nyo Aung Myint. He's a former member of Myanmar's ruling party, the National League for Democracy. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Nyo Aung Myint, let me start with you. Do you believe that the sentencing was just and fair?
First of all, I don't really want to criticize the judgment, but also that these 2 journalists I know personally, and then they are very nice people, and they are very active, and last 5 years, and then they follow the news. But in this case, that this is more like kind of political, as well as the very sensitive at the west, northwest, the Rakhine, the conflict situation. In this case, that first I thought that it was like kind of they might have like a very light sentence, but that's the 2 controversial and 2 split it in that the public opinion that I found it last 24 hours, and then some journalists and liberals and other the democratic principles, people who believe that the current government has been improving a lot of the democratization and rule of law. But it was a shock. But the other side, that the public opinion, majority thought that this is they created the problem of the situation, because some people pointed out that the Hindu community has been slaughtered, the whole village has been killed, and then so more than 100 people killed. But the Reuters or other international base, the media never covered. Why? That's the question.
Okay, so you're giving some, I guess, context for flavor of public opinion towards the end of that, and perhaps we'll have more time to look at that. But interesting to hear this view from you, because we've had you on the program before, and this is probably the most critical I've ever heard you of authorities in Myanmar, which fascinates me. And we'll come back to you in a moment. Kin Maung So, as the lawyer of the 2 men, they believe they were framed. The government says, listen, state secrets, you undermine national security, we put you in jail. Tell me what the defense is and how you feel about the sentencing.
The sentencing, the verdict by the trial court is very disappointing. Disappointing not for the lawyers, not only for the lawyers, it's disappointing not for the accused, the 2 journalists. It's disappointing for the whole of Myanmar, for the whole country, and it's disappointing for democracy and establishing democracy in the country, and it's disappointing for the rule of law, and it's disappointing for the freedom of expression, and it's disappointing for the press freedom. Therefore, it's disappointing for any party, any corner.
Okay, so Nyo Aung Myint, is the lesson that if you report on these, as you mentioned, sensitive issues, you're going to go to jail. So stay away from it. Don't talk about it.
It depends, because when the U.S. government has been sentenced the lady of the leaking to the WikiLeaks for the 25 years in jail. So that depends on the people, how your country should be shielded by the law and order. That I heard that some, the rumors saying that, the two gentlemen is trying to get it like information, and then they're trying to, because, that's a very critical moment.
Okay.
Some,
Can we put WikiLeaks aside for a second, right? Because, so you've given an analogy and a comparison there. We have a situation where the two go and report on an issue of the alleged killings of 10 Rohingya in Indin. They go to jail. They're in jail now for 7 years. During that time that they were on trial, the military actually came out and said, yes, we did do it, and we did kill those people. Doesn't that make a mockery of the whole system?
I think because of the Indian village happened was that that's an ambush started from the Bengalis or Rohingyas, what you call that the Rohingyas, and the people were the army convoy were attacked, and then that's the rule of engagement. They thought that because the government claimed that the author is that the terrorists. But I'm pretty sure that the country like Myanmar doesn't have any knowledge of what is a terrorist, how they are. And then it's a civilian, how they holding an arm,
but again,
or they have.
Let me simplify this, right? Because you're providing context and a justification for the killing. You're saying they thought they were terrorists, right? We can discuss that to the ends of the earth, but I don't think we have time for that. Hold on.
I just like to clarify that it was at the extrajudiciary killing. I really oppose it.
Okay.
They already sentenced and they have been jailed.
Okay. Let me ask you, Kin Mongzo, about the claim that the two men were framed by the police about receiving sensitive documents in a restaurant. Tell me a bit more about that and why you are so convinced that they were framed.
Yes. At the very first, the Wallon and Joshua who has informed through their families, through their wives, do we as lawyers about that frame up, and they said they were framed. At first, I am a little bit skeptical about it. I doubt it a little bit because maybe they put it as a reason for the arrest, and they really chased unlawfully about the policeman and trying to bribe or something like this. But when in the process of the hearing and cross-examining the prosecuting witnesses, I am convinced that Wallon's claim that they were framed up, they were set up, is right. And then even the prosecuting witness, a very important prosecuting witness, police officer of the rank of the major, Moyan 9, appeared in front of the court, all clad in uniforms. And then he said, all those things are set up. His words, his testimony in front of the court clearly coincides with Wallon's statement.
Understood.
Before the court,
Okay.
And
right
after he testified, the next hearing, he was not in uniform. He was in the prison uniform with white collars and with handcuffs and with the foot chains like this. So, how can he change like this? He is the testimony, that's the real, reliable testimony that they were framed up.
Okay. And that's an interesting point that you make. Your Own Min, very finally, the UN Secretary General has asked Myanmar and has urged authorities in Myanmar to review their decision. Do you think that that's a fair call for authorities to review this decision, this conviction of 7 years in prison for the two journalists?
I think, I'm really, because, the Wallon is a very, close, and we look like a kind of the friends, and I'm really sorry for their families, and I'm very sorry for the Gwangjomu go Joseon as well. But I think the government because I just the out of the country for a week, and then I heard that that's a lot of the justice system in Myanmar should be reviewed because of the interference from the other the branches like executive. And some rumors saying that the verdict day was been postponed for so many reasons. And then of course they should have because from the government side, because they are worried that if they free these two gentlemen, that's going to be future another involvement of that buying that the information or stealing or right now, because I admitted that our country doesn't have any rule of law. That's a problem.
Okay, well, we'll bring you back on the show to unpack that a bit more. But unfortunately, I'm out of time. I have to move on. But it's been good to talk to both of you. Hope you both come back onto the program. Kin Maung So and Nyo Aung Min.
Oh, yes.
Thank you very much. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Tripoli declares a state of emergency after days of fierce fighting. How can rival Libyan factions find peace? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.